What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, diving into some budget decks I've been brewing up with the release of Karlov Manor here in MTG Arena. I only have a few right now that I'm kind of slowly going through, trying to get some games in, making the tweaks, and trying to get them just right. So with that being said, let's just dive into the decks and let's just start talking about them. So the first deck we have up is going to be Boros Convoke tokens. This is kind of a deck that is kind of a meta deck for the most part. There is a new card with the release of the new set that kind of makes a more low to the ground, small creature style deck kind of work pretty well. And that card is going to be War Leader's Call. This is a new enchantment. It's 3 mana. Creatures you control get +1/+1. And whenever a creature you control enters the battlefield under our turn, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. So makes these little small creatures that don't really seem to be anything special be a little bit more aggressive, especially early on as we build up the game. Another card that we are playing with that's actually a pretty decent budget card is going to be Case of the Gateway Express. And I do think this is another card, yet again, because we are on a budget, is kind of a little bit more of a unique card we could play until we maybe get something that's maybe a little bit better. Overall, it's a little bit of removal with the first effect when it first initially comes in. The second effect here is that we just have to attack with 3 or more creatures, which is definitely very possible with this deck. And the last effect is creatures we control will get +1/+0, so buffing our creatures that much more. Other than that, in our 1-drop slot, anything special that really sticks out, I would say the first card is going to be the Novice Inspector. This is a new card that comes in the battlefield. It is a 1/2 and creates a clue. It's kind of like another additional effect that we have on top of the Voider and Epicure as another card that's a 1 mana, 1 card that also creates an artifact, because we are also playing the Gleeful Demolition. Yet again, another card that works very well with the style of deck because it is a card that we can sacrifice an artifact. We can generate 3 Goblin tokens. And yet again, if we do this effect after the fact, we've done this effect, we can then generate a little bit of pressure on our opponent because those 3/1/1s will enter the battlefield. That's 2/2s, and then all of a sudden they're dealing 1 point of damage each to your opponent, which is definitely pretty effective. And then to kind of round it out, we do have a little bit of Convoke in the deck. I would say when you upgrade it, you'll get a little bit probably more Convoke as you do it. We have Stoke the Flames as a little bit of removal or damage to your opponent's face if they're getting kind of low. And then the other top end card that we really have that helps finish off our opponent is going to be the Imodane's Recruiter. You can play for its 5 mana Adventure side and create 2 knights if we need it. But really the effective part about this is that you kind of play this on 3. You give all your creatures haste included in itself, and then an additional buff of +1/+0, which is definitely very strong. So overall, yet again, this is a deck that is quite low to the ground. It is definitely trying to be very aggressive very quickly, kind of similar to what mono red would be. But we are splashing away for some more effective cards. And I guess I can't forget, I also did add in a couple copies of Lightning Helix just because it's always good to have a little bit of spot removal that also gains you a little bit of life. And it's definitely a very effective spot removal card for this style of deck. In the sideboard here, we actually have a few cards I do think you look at when it comes in terms to upgrading. The first one is Anam Pakal. I think this one actually kind of makes sense to add into the deck because it is one of those cards that will help us generate additional tokens. It will also itself grow, which I think makes this card pretty effective for a deck that is trying to get low to the ground, make tokens. They are also artifacts, so you can use them for the Gleeful Demolition. Another card that's actually pretty solid too that you could probably replace the Case in the 2-drop slot is going to be Virtual Loyalty. It starts as a 2 mana instant speed spell that you get a 2/2 white knight token with vigilance, and then if you do cast it at 5, you can then then you can slowly build up your creatures, untapping all of them so that you can attack in with them aggressively, and then have them back as blockers with additional +1/+1 counter on it at the end of each of your turns going forward. And the other thing I would say that really needs to be done to the deck that I think will help it overall, just because I do think it's the one kind of part of the deck that kind of is clunky right now, even in budget form, is going to be the lands. I would say the lands are pretty important here. Getting your Battlefield Forges out, getting your Sundown Passes into the deck, and kind of cutting the tap lands is going to help this deck overall feel that much better and run a little bit smoother. Other than that, a couple other cards that could be messed around with if you want to kind of go with a little bit more of putting more pressure on the battlefield. Knight Errant Eos helps us dig a little bit into our library, helps us look at the top 2 cards of our deck based on X, where X is the number of creatures that convoke this card. So yet again, we're a deck that tries to convoke a bunch. This Knight Errant Eos will help us dig a little bit. We don't have a ton of card draw, so helping us keep our handful of creatures that we can put on the battlefield, keep the pressure going. And the fact that you technically, if you have enough creatures out, you don't actually have to cast this for any mana, which is definitely very good. And then other than that, I have Wedding Announcement here. Yet again, another kind of enchantment that you can mess around with if you have this. Maybe not the Virtue. Put it in maybe replace the Cases with this. This is another card that's just going to generate tokens. It will eventually get to the 3rd chapter, which will also give us additional +1/+1 buff. And then Adeline, I think, makes sense in a token style deck. She will get buffed based on how many creatures we have out, other than her, including herself. And then every time we attack, we're also going to produce a token, which yet again, hand in hand, works very well with our enchantment here, just because we'll get a trigger every time creature on our side will attack and essentially get a replacement creature as well. So overall, it's a very fun deck. It's a very aggressive deck, I would say. And like I said, the first thing I would recommend really doing if you don't have them is probably try to focus on the mana base and just get the untapped lands. It will just help the mana base feel that much better, because sometimes when I was testing this deck, it was kind of clunky because I had to play tap lands where I really wanted to play a 1 mana drop or a 2 mana drop, and I only had one untapped basic and then a dual land. So definitely something that could require more tweaking. Upgrade it makes it much better, but this is definitely a good area to start if this is something that you're really looking to for playing an aggressive style deck that isn't mono red. The next deck up out of all of them is probably the most thematic to the new set, Karlov Manor. We got Azorius Detectives. This is kind of like a mid-rangey, maybe a little bit aggro-y, kind of tempo-y style deck. The whole premise of this deck was kind of playing around the new detective archetype. We do have our 3-mana detective lore that other detectives we control get +1/+1. Whenever we draw a second card each turn, a detective is unblockable, which is definitely pretty effective. I think this, out of all of the decks, is probably the most expensive in terms of rarities, just because I think I included 6 rares. The other cards are actually right above the rares that we did include. One of them being the Forensic Gadgeteer. This is another unique card I think is pretty solid. It makes our clues be able to be sacrificed for 1 mana, so it's definitely good there. Though you can't reduce the effect less than, so if you have multiples of these out, you still have to pay 1 for your artifact. And we also have Cryptic Coat, yet again another solid card. I think is a little bit underrated. I definitely, after playing with this card, really see the true power of this. We essentially cloak the top card of our library, which essentially puts it face down as a morph creature or the disguise creature, and then gives it a buff of +1/+0. It also gains ward because it has that effect there, and it's also unblockable, so your opponent has to really deal with that creature or deal with the artifact to really deal with what's going on. And if it's a creature card that's actually cloaked, we can actually pay the mana cost of that creature at any point to flip it face up. And if our creature ends up dying in the process at some point during the game, we can always bounce the cloak back to its hand to maybe avoid removal the opponent may be playing against it, or just get another creature off the top of our library if we're really not really drawing a ton of threats to put onto the battlefield. Overall, really effective card. I feel like it's one of those things that doesn't seem very good initially, but it is something that can cause problems for your opponent pretty well. Downside, I think, only to this card is that you can't move it from creature to creature. It only can cloak things, and that's the only way things get equipped with it. So that's kind of the weird clunkiness with the card overall. Other than that, most of the deck is just full of other thematic things from the set. Outside of, I would say, Duskward's Reliquary, this is a solid artifact, I think, that works very well with this deck, because this deck can generate clues, which we can then sacrifice to this spell to then get a 1 mana, remove target creature, exile target artifact or creature opponent controls until this leaves the battlefield, and it has wards, so it's definitely pretty solid protection. So definitely a card that I think works very well, just because, our 1 mana Novice Inspector creates a clue. We can then get a clue from actually casting this, so it's like we sack a clue to cast this, and then this will generate a clue in return of us casting the artifact spell, so it's definitely kind of an interesting interaction that we have there. We have Curious Inquiry. This is another card that helps us generate clues if our creatures dealt damage. We can put it on our unblockable creature, or we can just put it on a creature if our opponent doesn't really have any big threats. Mirroring Spy, Mistway Spy is kind of another unique disguise card. You put it face down for 3, flip it up for 2. When it's turned face up, whenever a creature we control deals combat damage to a player, we investigate, so just another way to make clues. You kind of get the idea of what the theme of the deck is. It's generate clues, because we don't have a ton of very strong cards outside the few rares we have. It's definitely getting card advantage is going to be the best way we really can do it. 2-drop slot, we have Case of the Pilfered Proof. This is another interesting one that works very well with our detectives. Whenever a detective enters the battlefield under our control, and whenever a detective we control is turned face up, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on it, so buffing our detectives, making them a little bit harder to deal with. If we control 3 or more detectives, we solve the case, and then if one or more tokens would be created under our control, put those tokens plus a clue token are created instead. So basically, whenever we investigate and when we have this solved, we essentially will get 2 clues for the price of 1 for 1 effect, which is definitely pretty solid. Not on my watch is a spot removal spell, pretty solid 2 mana, exile target attacking creature, kind of like a Wandering Emperor effect, but doesn't worry about the creature being tapped or not, so overall pretty solid there. Got a counter spell here. We also have a Exit Specialist, a solid card that can get in for some damage. It's unblockable by things that are with power 3 or greater, which is pretty solid. We can also disguise it, flip it face up, and bounce something back to our opponent's hand, kind of playing that tempo play. Do it on our opponent's turn, do it during our turn, whatever we need to do to get damage through. And then in the top end of the deck, we also have the Granite Witness, a 4 mana 3/2. We can disguise it and then flip it face up for 2, which is pretty good. And when we flip it face up, we may tap or untap target creature. So you can utilize this depending on how we want to use the effect most effectively. Most of the time, you're going to flip it face up and tap something down so you get some damage through. But overall, this deck actually feels pretty good. It's definitely kind of fun. It's definitely, I would say, really budget. Most of the decks that I lost to when I played this deck were decks that just had higher value. You know, they had things like they were playing better mythics, stuff like that. So it is something that it's going to take some time probably to see if the detective deck really finds a place in standard. But if you're looking for something to play detectives and you're looking for somewhere to start, I definitely think this list is pretty solid. And then in terms of possible upgrades in the sideboard, like I said, I was trying to keep the rares at the minimum, but I want to play all the different, detectives to kind of try them out. 10th District Hero is a kind of interesting card. Downside of this deck, it doesn't really put a lot of things in the graveyard, so I don't know if the collecting the evidence part is going to be very effective. But a 2-mana 2/3 is always very good. That eventually turns into detective, so definitely good there. We have Officious Interrogation, a 2-mana spell that we can target, multiple opponents, but typically in Arena, you're only going to have one opponent, so you're only paying the 2 mana, and you get to make that many clues based on how many creatures that player controls at instant speed, so definitely another cool card to kind of generate some clues if you really need to draw additional cards. Wojak Investigator, at the beginning of our upkeep, we investigate once for each opponent who has more cards in their hand than you. It is a 3-mana 2/4 Flying Vigilance, so also another solid card. Steam Core Scholar, another good card. It's a 3-mana 2/2 Flying Vigilance. When ETBs, we draw 2 cards and we discard 2 cards unless we discard an instant or sorcery or a creature flying. So we get a creature plus a little bit of a card draw effect, which is definitely pretty solid there. We got Alquist, Prophet, Master Sleuth, another interesting detective. It's not really anything special. It's a 3-mana 3/3, but really this is one of those cards as the game goes on. It has the effect of tap in X plus a white into blue to sacrifice a clue and draw X cards and gain X life. So if you probably want to maybe make the deck a little bit more controlling, have a controlling aspect to it, this could be a good card to look at. We have Irzem, the Agency Chief. It's a 5-mana 5/5 flying. When it enters the battlefield, we investigate twice, so we create 2 clues. And then if we have open mana, we can sacrifice any of our artifacts or a clue, basically, and give it our choice of Vigilance, Lifelink, and or Hexproof, which is definitely very good at protecting it. And then other than that, the only things we really have left in the list here that you could add into the deck is just upgrading the mana base, add in some Adakar Waste, add in Deserted Beaches, add in Seachrome Coast if you want to go a little bit more aggressive, you want more lands that are dual lands on the battlefield untapped. So overall, yet again, another very cool thematic list. It's definitely something I'm going to explore. I'm going to probably make an upgraded version of this and test it out a little bit more, but definitely another cool thematic deck that comes from Murders at Karlov Manor. And the last deck we have up is going to be a Golgari Self-Mill. This is actually a fun deck. I feel like I've seen other people build their own variations, but we went for more of a budget-focused version of the deck. It doesn't play a ton of rares. I think at most it's 2 rares, 2 mythics, and that is about it. It's just a bunch of commons and uncommons from the new set and some other sets that kind of have like some benefits of being self-mill and helping us remove things. But I think the key card of this deck, if you haven't seen it already, is going to be the Insidious Roots. This is a card that I thought about putting on my list of cards that you should look out for from the new set, though I did put this kind of like, I lean more on the fringe just because it has to be in a very specific deck really to be super effective, whereas I think some of the other cards I went over kind of have a little bit more of utility in other decks, not just one style of deck. But this card in itself, this is a 2-mana enchantment. Creature tokens we control have tap, add 1 mana of any color, which is already very good. And then the secondary effect here is what really makes this card super effective, is that whenever one or more creature cards leave our graveyard, we create a 0/1 green plant creature token and put +1/+1 counter on each plant creature we control. So basically what happens is if we have any sort of trigger that exiles something from our graveyard, or even if our opponent has something where they start eating our creatures from our graveyard, like a Trespasser, we can trigger this, which is definitely very good, and get plant creature tokens out, which then can generate for mana. And then if we can create any other tokens, they can also be tapped down for mana, which also makes it pretty effective. So overall, very good card, and definitely helps this deck really get going. Another card that works very well in the deck in the common slot for 1 mana is going to be this Snarling Gorehound. This is a 1 mana 1/1 menace. And then whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under our control, we surveil 1. This card in itself is very good. It helps us fill our graveyard up, helps us get creature cards in our graveyard very early, or just helps us get cards into the graveyard that maybe we don't want to draw immediately. And in itself, also have a menace makes it quite hard to block, especially in the early game when your opponent may be only playing 1 creature or 2 creatures, maybe in the first few turns. So definitely something that works very well in general. After that, we have Deathbond Sprout, another card that works very well in a deck that worries about putting things in their own graveyard. Initially, we mill a card during our upkeep. Then if there are 3 more creature cards into our upkeep in our graveyard, we flip this over to its 3/3 side. And then after that, at the beginning of our upkeep, we can exile a card from a graveyard. If it's a creature card, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on this. This in itself will work very well with the roots because we exile a creature from our graveyard. We put a +1/+1 counter on this. We then get a plant token, so you kind of see how that works in general. Then we have the Rubble Bolt Maverick, another 1-mana, 1/1 card, ETBs or Surveil 2. So we can either put things into the graveyard if we don't like it on top of our library. And then when this dies or goes to the graveyard at any point, we can pay 1 mana at sorcery speed and give a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control. So yet again, another effect that will help this leave the graveyard pretty effectively. We have a couple Seed of Hopes as a 1-mana, 1-mana instant speed spell that we can do at any point. We mill 2 cards. We can put a permanent card from among milled cards into our hand and gain 2 life. So yet again, another card we can use kind of help us kind of get creatures back from the graveyard off the top of our library, or get permanent cards like lands and stuff like that if we really need them. Overall, very good card, and a little bit of life gain never hurts nonetheless. In the 2-drop slot, we have a couple go for the throats just for some spot removal. We have the Undead Butler, a 1-mana or a 2-mana 1/2. When ETBs, we mill 3 cards, and then when it dies, we can exile it. When we do, we can return a creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield to our hand. So yet again, its secondary effect exiles itself, so it leaves the graveyard after it goes to the graveyard. So then we get a trigger of the roots as well. We have the Aftermath Analyst. This is not really a card that's going to help really trigger the roots, but in itself, because we're doing a lot of milling, we mill 3 cards when this ETBs, and then on turn 4, or when we have 4 mana open, we can sacrifice this card and return all land cards that would have been milled from our deck onto the battlefield tapped, which is definitely pretty effective. On turn 4, it wouldn't be out of the realm of possibly having 8 or 9 lands by the time you go to turn 5. So definitely a very good card in itself. It's also a 1/3 blocker for 2, which is definitely not that bad. After that, we have Scrap Gorger as a 2-mana 0/3. As long as it has 3 or more oil counters on it, it has +3/+0. So our +3, so it becomes a 3/3 essentially once it gets 3 oil counters. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any color, and then you eat something from a graveyard. No matter what it is, we'll get an oil counter, which is definitely pretty effective. And if we have creatures in our graveyard, we want to trigger the roots. We can eat a creature, trigger the roots, which is definitely very good there. Because we are playing Self-Mill, for the most part with the Surveils and the cards that mill themselves, it's always very good to have a Micro Tyrant in the deck because it is a 3-mana star. Its power and toughness are equal to the number of the fungus and saplings we control. So itself counts, the tokens it generates counts, and also the sprouts count, so it can definitely come out in the battlefield as like a 2/2 or a 3/3 depending on how far you are into the game. After that, the other effect too is very good here. At the beginning of our end step, we create X/1/1 black fungus creature tokens where that can't block based on the number of times we descended. So you see how many things we have that actually mill stuff into our own graveyard. We can definitely get a big descend even the turn it comes out. So if they can't deal with it immediately, all of a sudden we're going to descend for like maybe 5, 6 if we're really lucky, depending on how effective our spells have been the turn that led up to this. Other than that, we have the Sky Fisher Spider, another card that kind of helps us remove things from the battlefield. We can sacrifice a creature. When we do, we destroy target non-land permanent. Depending on what the game state is, you can sacrifice one of our tokens from the Micro Tyrant. You can sacrifice one of the plant tokens from the roots. You can even sacrifice maybe one of your Mavericks from the graveyard if you really are trying to find a way to maybe get a trigger of roots out. So this is definitely not bad there. And it destroys target non-land permanent, which typically, could be kind of tricky if one has like a planeswalker, you don't really have any good attacks, or they have a big creature, or they have an enchantment that you really can't deal with because typically black doesn't have a ton of ways to deal with enchantments. Green does, but this is kind of our branch between the two because it's quite effective. Also has reach, which is definitely pretty nice. And then when this dies, we can gain 1 life for each creature card in our graveyard. If we do, then exile it from our graveyard, which then, in theory, triggers our roots. So you kind of see the theme of the deck overall, just trying to figure out how to fit things in the graveyard to get exiled from the graveyard, which then triggers our roots to kind of get the benefit of roots. Essentially, the roots is kind of the card that carries this deck, just because I think this effect is kind of underrated. If you haven't seen it, once you play this, you'll see how effective this effect is. And this deck is actually pretty good, even in the budget form. And then the last card we kind of have here is going to be Azani. This is just kind of a top-end card. It's kind of a unique card. It's kind of a card that is kind of expensive to invest in because it does cost 6 mana. It's a 5/4 with Menace. But the unique thing about this is that when ETBs, it has a collect evidence effect of collecting evidence 4. If we do, we create 2/2/1 black spider creature tokens with Menace and Reach, which helps us maybe deal with things in the air, which the deck doesn't really have a ton of ways of dealing with outside of the couple spot removal spells. The other effect here that's actually really good too is that we can sacrifice 4 tokens. We can Surveil 2, draw 2 cards, and gain 2 life. So depending on how many Saprolin tokens we maybe generate from the Micro Tyrant, we can always sacrifice some of those creatures that can't block, get a little bit more card advantage, or get the life when it really matters, or even try to throw things in the graveyard to help us trigger the roots when we really need to. But overall, this is definitely kind of a unique list. It's definitely a very very effective list, I would say, overall, just because from what I played so far of this list, I've done very well. I think the overall record of this deck is probably like somewhere around like 7-3 in my games I've been playing. I've made tweaks over the process of where I started to where I am currently, just in numbers of what I have and how many copies. But this is definitely a very effective list, definitely a very fun deck. It does something a little bit different than I think a lot of decks currently do in the format. So if you're looking for something to switch things up, it's not a bad list to take a look at. And then in the sideboard, just to give you a heads up of things to look out for, maybe you already own them. First card up is going to be Willowgeist. It's a 1-mana 1/1. Whenever one or more cards leave our graveyard, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on Willowgeist. So you kind of see, yet again, another card that comes into the deck that helps us trigger our effects of the it gets additional effect of Insidious Roots. Also, we gain life equal to its power. So as this grows, we'll eventually gain life. You have a Tenacious Underdog here. It's a 2-mana 3/2, but it does have Blitz. So this is kind of a cool effect here. We can pay 2 life. We can cast Tenacious Underdog from our graveyard using its Blitz ability. So it is a 3/2 that kind of has a way in itself has a way of just reoccurring over and over again. And this card is actually very good about triggering the roots in general, just because it comes, if it does, once it dies, we draw a card and then it goes back to the graveyard, which we can then do it again. Graveyard Trespasser is very good too. It's a card that will eat cards from graveyard, so we can eat a creature card from our graveyard if we really need to, gain a little bit of life, make our opponent lose a little bit of life. If it flips to nighttime, we can then eat 2 creatures and then gain 2 life, which is definitely not that bad, but it's yet again another effective card that has a little bit of ward. So if we want something that's a little bit more effective about eating things, it's definitely not bad. You can also look at Lord Skitter. When ETBs under our control, exile up to 1 target card from an opponent's graveyard, and at the beginning of our combat during our turn, we create a 1/1 black creature token with this creature can't block. Another interesting card. It's not a card that's really good for roots, but it's definitely not bad about creating tokens to help maybe generate ways to sacrifice for your Azani. It's definitely not like probably the high priority on the list. And then after that, other cards you can look out for are things like Takenuma. This is a card that will kind of mill yourself. And then you can return a creature card from our graveyard, which then trigger roots, which is definitely not bad. Beseiju just is another effective way, just maybe dealing with maybe an artifact and or enchantment, or even a non-basic land your opponent controls, so definitely not bad there. It's always good to have, a copy of these each in any deck if you're playing the colors. Deathclap Glade, just, additional dual lands that have more of an effect that come in the battlefield untap as the game goes on. Land of War Waste, if you want to be a little more aggressive on mana, you can make black or green, but pay life in the process. And then Cottage as well. Cottage is another effective card. Itself becomes a creature land. And then whenever it attacks, you can exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard. So you can eat things from your graveyard, get a food token out of it, which then triggers roots. So you then kind of see how, this deck works overall. And like I said, this one is a very fun deck. I think out of the 3 decks I went over in today's video, this is my most fun. I'll have links down in the description below if you want to check them out. I also have links down for my Untapped GG profile if you want to check out like my overall records with the decks, as you can kind of see what I was kind of messing around with. You can kind of see what I've added, dropped to kind of get to this finalized list of each. So let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. If you like any of these decks or been playing maybe some similar versions of this decks, I always like to hear that. If you want to see when I do play testing of these decks live, I actually stream on twitch.tv/thescartv 3 nights a week. And that's kind of where I've been playtesting and kind of making my adjustments of decks live. So you can always ask questions there. And if you like the video, hit that like button. Definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, when I post new videos like this one here on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But until next time, I'll see you in the next video.